The chandeliers of the Orion Grand Hotel ballroom wept light, scattering diamond-hard reflections across a sea of tailored tuxedos and gemstone-laden gowns. For the attendees of the annual Children's Ward Foundation Gala, this glittering spectacle was the very air they breathed. For Ilara Vance, it was a cage. The air, thick with the dueling perfumes of hothouse roses and vintage Dom Perignon, was suffocating. Every clink of crystal, every burst of manufactured laughter, was a note in a symphony of a life she could never have. At 22, Ilara moved with a ghostly efficiency that was the hallmark of her profession. Her black uniform was a void against the riot of color in the room, her silver tray a steady, unobtrusive moon orbiting the planets of New York's high society. To be seen was to fail. To be invisible was to be perfect. She was a silent cog in the grand, opulent machine. Her manager, a perpetually harried man named Mr. Abernathy, had given the staff their usual briefing. Smile, serve, disappear. These people are not your friends. Don't make eye contact unless you are spoken to, and for God's sake, don't spill anything. Don't engage. It was a mantra Ilara lived by. Her feet, encased in sensible orthopedic-soled shoes, were already a dull, throbbing ache. Her mind was miles away, in a cramped apartment in Queens, where the scent of rubbing alcohol and regret always lingered. She was replaying the conversation from that morning with her father's physical therapist. The new medication is showing promise, Ilara, but his insurance won't cover it. The out-of-pocket cost is considerable. Considerable. It was a gentle word for a number that had felt like a punch to the gut. 4 years. It had been 4 years since she'd last touched the polished ivory of a grand piano. 4 years since the accident that had shattered her father's body and her family's future. 4 years since she'd traded the 88 keys of a Steinway for the endless parade of canapes on a silver tray. The dream of Juilliard, once a brilliant, burning sun in her future, had collapsed into a black hole of medical bills and filial duty. Sometimes, in the dead of night, her fingers would twitch on her thin blanket, phantom limbs reaching for chords that were no longer there. She could still feel the weight of the keys, the satisfying thrum of the strings vibrating through the wood, the shared silence of an auditorium holding its breath. It was an amputation of the soul, and the ache was constant. She was refilling water goblets at table 7 when she felt it. A gaze that was not the usual dismissive sweep, but a sharp, dissecting stare, laced with a cold, predatory amusement. She risked a glance upwards, her practiced, neutral smile wavering for an imperceptible instant. The eyes belonged to Julian Croft Jr. You didn't need to know the name to recognize the breed. He was sculpted from generations of unearned confidence, his jawline sharp, his dark hair artfully disheveled, a Patek Philippe on his wrist that could have paid for her father's care for a decade. He was the sole heir to the Croft development empire, a soulless monolith of steel and glass that had devoured half of the city's skyline, leaving a trail of broken, smaller businesses in its wake. Julian was lounging in his chair, a king holding court. To his right was his fiancée, Tiffany van der Sloot, a woman so meticulously starved and surgically perfected, she looked less human than a prototype. Her smile was a thin, cruel slash of crimson. On his left, 2 sycophants, interchangeable in their bespoke suits and braying laughs, hung on his every word. Julian's eyes roamed over Ilara, not as a person, but as a piece of furniture that had momentarily caught his interest. He nudged Tiffany. "Look at them," he murmured, his voice a low drawl that still managed to carry. "They move like wind-up toys, all so serious, so programmed." Tiffany let out a tinkling, brittle laugh. "Don't be a beast, darling. She's just trying to earn her 20%. Ilara's jaw tightened. A muscle in her cheek began to twitch. "Disappear. Don't engage." She continued her task, her movements fluid and controlled, her dignity the only armor she possessed. She finished the last goblet and began to retreat, her back ramrod straight. "Excuse me." Julian's voice was a whip crack in the ambient noise. "You, waitress." Ilara froze, then turned slowly. "Sir?" He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the pristine white tablecloth beside his wineglass. There, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a single tiny dark red droplet, a bead of Cabernet no larger than a freckle. "There," he said, a smirk dancing on his lips. "Sloppy." The accusation was a deliberate, calculated spark thrown into the tinderbox of her exhaustion and anxiety. The sycophants, Chad and Bryce, or whatever their names were, snickered on cue. Tiffany watched with the placid interest of a cat observing a mouse. It was a game, a casual exercise of power to stave off the evening's boredom. A hot flush of rage crawled up Alara's neck. All night she had been a ghost, a pair of hands. This tiny public cruelty was an attempt to render her less than that. Mr. Abernathy's words echoed in her ears. She inhaled slowly, forcing the anger down. "My deepest apologies, sir. I will fetch a cloth at once." Her voice was a miracle of professional composure. But Julian wasn't done. He leaned forward, his dark eyes glinting with a mean-spirited inspiration. "A cloth isn't going to fix this atmosphere of dreary competence," he said, taking a deliberate sip of his wine. On the main stage, the jazz trio was finishing a sleepy standard. A hush fell as they transitioned, a stagehand wheeling out a magnificent, gleaming black Steinway grand piano for the evening's featured performer, who wasn't due for another hour. The piano sat under the spotlights, a silent, majestic beast. Julian's smirk widened into a predatory grin. He had an idea, a spectacular, cruel idea. "You know," he announced, his voice now pitched to capture the attention of the surrounding tables, "my friends and I were just lamenting the complete absence of genuine artistry in the world. Everyone is just going through the motions." His gaze landed squarely back on Alara. "I bet you don't have a single artistic bone in your body, do you?" Her silence was his confirmation. He rose from his chair, a towering figure of inherited wealth and custom tailoring. "I have a proposition for you," he declared, his voice ringing with theatricality. The chatter at nearby tables died down. People were turning, sensing the blood in the water. "I dare you," he said, pointing a dramatic finger at the gleaming piano on the stage. "I dare you to go up there and play something. Anything at all." A collective, shocked murmur rippled through the audience. Tiffany's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose in genuine surprise before settling back into a mask of amused condescension. This was far better than she had imagined. "Julian, you're being ridiculous," she purred, a token protest meant only to fuel his ego. "Am I?" he boomed. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a slim, platinum money clip, thick with $100 bills. He began to peel them off, slapping them down onto the table one by one. The crisp thwack of the notes echoed in the sudden silence. $25,000, he announced to the rap ballroom. "Your tip for the night. If you can go up there and play just one piece of music. Chopin. Let's make it. Etude Opus 25, number 11. The Winter Wind." He named one of the most notoriously difficult pieces in the solo piano repertoire, a piece that professional concert pianists struggled with. He looked at her, his eyes glittering with malice. "But if you can't, if you play a single wrong note, or if you refuse, you're fired." He glanced over to where Mr. Abernathy was now power-walking towards them, his face a sickly shade of gray. "I will personally speak to the hotel's board. I'll make sure you never work in a service position in this city again." It was the perfect airtight trap, a public spectacle engineered for her failure and humiliation. He, a man who had everything, versus her, a waitress in worn-out shoes. He wasn't just daring her to play the piano. He was daring her to have a soul, a history, a life beyond his perception of her, knowing she would be crushed in the attempt. Alara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every sane instinct screamed at her to apologize, to grovel, to melt away. But then she looked at his face, the smug certainty, the absolute conviction that she was less than human, an object for his amusement. She saw every rejection, every condescending dismissal, every moment she had been forced to bite her tongue and swallow her pride. And she thought of the phantom ache in her fingers. She looked at the pile of money on the table. $25,000. It wasn't just a tip. It was the experimental medication for her father. It was a down payment on a small, accessible apartment. It was a year without the constant, grinding terror of poverty. But it wasn't the money that made her decision. It was his eyes. It was the utter dismissive contempt in them, the belief that she was nothing. Across the ballroom, at a table tucked away in a discreet corner, Arthur Vance, the reclusive head of Vance Industries, lowered his whiskey glass. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen the rise and fall of corporate empires. His rivalry with the Croft family was the stuff of Wall Street legend, a Cold War fought in boardrooms and stock markets for 2 decades. He had come tonight only as a favor to a board member, and he had been bored to the point of leaving, until now. He had been watching the young Croft heir's boorish display with a kind of detached, clinical interest. He'd seen this kind of petty tyranny before, but he saw something else too, in the waitress, a flicker of something in her posture, a subtle shift from fear to something harder. He leaned forward slightly, his usual cynical mask replaced by a flicker of genuine curiosity. He had a feeling the evening's entertainment was about to begin. Ilara took a slow, deep breath. The cacophony of the ballroom seemed to recede, fading into a distant roar. Her gaze met Julian's, and the servile mask she had worn all night dissolved, replaced by an expression of profound, unnerving calm. "All right," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, slicing through the tense silence. "I accept." A wave of shocked whispers washed through the room. Julian Croft Jr.'s arrogant grin faltered, just for a moment. He hadn't actually believed she would accept. The dare was a performance of power. Her refusal was meant to be the climax. Her acceptance flipped the script. But his colossal ego, a creature fed on a lifelong diet of deference, quickly righted itself. Of course she accepted. For that kind of money, what desperate little prole wouldn't? This would be even more humiliating and therefore more entertaining than he'd hoped. "Splendid," he boomed, clapping his hands together. "A little fight. I admire that." He made a grand sweeping gesture toward the stage. "The stage is yours." Mr. Abernathy finally skidded to a halt at the table, his face slick with sweat. "Mr. Croft, sir, I must insist," he began, his voice a frantic squeak. "Ilara, this is insane. Go to the kitchens, now." Ilara didn't even look at him. Her eyes were still locked on Julian. "It's all right, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice retaining its astonishing firmness. "A public challenge was made. A public acceptance was given." Abernathy looked from Julian's sadistic smirk to Ilara's strange, resolute calm and knew he was utterly defeated. To intervene now would only escalate the spectacle and likely cost him his own job. He retreated a few steps, wringing his hands, his face a portrait of abject misery. Ilara's movements were methodical, almost ceremonial. First, she walked to a nearby service station and placed her silver tray down. Her hands were rock steady. The room watched, utterly captivated by this small, defiant ritual. Next, she reached behind her and untied the strings of her apron. She folded it twice with meticulous precision and laid it on the tray. It was a casting off of her role, a shedding of her invisibility cloak. Underneath, she wore a simple black blouse and black trousers, but without the apron, with her shoulders squared and her spine straight, she seemed to transform. The uniform was no longer a symbol of servitude. It was simply what she was wearing. Finally, she looked down at her feet, at the clunky, sensible black shoes that had carried her across miles of unforgiving marble. Without bending, she used the toe of one shoe to slip the heel off the other, then kicked it away. She did the same with the second. The two soft thuds on the plush carpet were like gunshots in the silent room. She stood before them in simple black socks. A new murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was a drama unfolding in real time. Across the room, Arthur Vance felt a ghost of a smile touch his lips. He'd seen countless negotiations, hostile takeovers, and corporate stare-downs. He recognized the look in the young woman's eyes. It wasn't the look of a terrified waitress. It was the look of a player who had just decided to go all in. Julian, reveling in being the center of attention, extended a hand with a mock chivalrous flourish. "Shall we?" Ilara ignored his hand. She walked past him, her head held high, and moved towards the stage. She took the 3 short steps up to the platform not like a waitress, but like a performer who had done it 1,000 times. She walked to the magnificent Steinway, its polished black surface reflecting the chandeliers like a still, dark lake. She ran a single reverent finger along its edge, then sat down on the leather bench. She closed her eyes for a single, fleeting moment. In that sliver of darkness, the ballroom dissolved. The cloying scent of roses was replaced by the familiar, comforting smell of old wood, felt, and lemon oil. The chatter of the 1% faded, and in its place she heard the voice of her first teacher, Madame Dubois, a formidable old Russian woman. The piano is not a machine, Alara. It is a beast with a heart of strings. You do not play it, you tame it. She opened her eyes. She placed her hands, small and unadorned, over the keys, not touching them, just hovering. She looked out, not at the crowd, but through them, to a point in the middle distance only she could see. Then she looked directly at Julian Croft Jr. A fire had been lit in the depths of her brown eyes. Opus 25, number 11, she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall with startling clarity, in a minor. And then she began to play. It did not start with a melody. It started with a whisper, a soft, chromatic murmur in the right hand, like the first stirrings of a winter wind. It was tentative, delicate, almost shy. The crowd leaned in. Julian Croft Jr. crossed his arms, a smug look on his face. He'd seen this before. A few plinked-out notes, a fumbling attempt, then tears and failure. This was the overture to her humiliation. But then the left hand entered, a powerful, thunderous theme that rolled up from the bass notes like a storm gathering on the horizon. The initial whisper in the right hand was not shyness. It was the calm before the tempest. Suddenly, the music exploded. Ilara's hands, which had been so steady carrying a tray of champagne, became a blur of motion. The whispering wind became a gale, a furious blizzard of arpeggios and chromatic scales that tore up and down the keyboard with terrifying speed and precision. This wasn't the tentative playing of an amateur. This was the controlled fury of a master. The sound that erupted from the Steinway was immense, a physical force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ballroom. The smug look on Julian's face evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. His fiancée, Tiffany, had her perfectly manicured hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. This was not supposed to happen. Alara was no longer a waitress. She had been transfigured by the music. Her body, which had been rigid with professional tension, was now fluid, swaying with the violent passion of the piece. She was not just playing the notes, she was living them. The music was a physical manifestation of 4 years of rage, of grief, of soul-crushing menial labor, of dreams deferred and denied. Every crashing chord was a medical bill. Every lightning-fast arpeggio was a 16-hour shift on her aching feet. The powerful, defiant melody in her left hand was the memory of her father's strength, and the swirling, chaotic blizzard in her right was the storm that had tried to destroy them. Across the room, Arthur Vance sat bolt upright. He was no connoisseur, but he knew enough about excellence to recognize it when he saw it. This wasn't just talent, it was something deeper. It was genius forged in pain. He looked at the woman playing, then at Julian Croft Jr.'s face, a mask of crumbling arrogance and dawning horror. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Vance felt a stir of something other than cynical detachment. It felt, alarmingly, like hope. The piece surged towards its climax. Ilara's entire being was focused on the keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration, beads of sweat tracing paths down her temples. She was completely lost in the music, a high priestess at the altar of her art. The storm of notes reached a fever pitch, a breathtaking, impossible cascade of sound that filled every corner of the vast room, silencing every thought, commanding every ounce of attention. And then, with 3 final, thunderous, defiant chords that rang out like the judgment of God, it was over. Her hands dropped from the keys. The final notes hung in the air, vibrating with power, before slowly, reluctantly, fading into absolute, profound silence. Ilara sat, her chest heaving, her head bowed. For a full 5 seconds, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. 300 of New York's most powerful and jaded people were frozen, stunned into stillness. Then one person began to clap. It was Arthur Vance. He was on his feet, his applause sharp, deliberate, and loud in the silent room. Then another person stood, and then the entire ballroom erupted. It was not the polite, restrained applause of a society gala. It was a roar, a tidal wave of sound, a standing ovation that crashed over Ilara in wave after thunderous wave. They were not applauding a waitress. They were acclaiming an artist. The sound washed over Ilara, a physical balm on her raw nerves. It was a sound she had thought she would never hear again. Slowly she lifted her head. She saw the sea of astonished faces, all turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. She saw Mr. Abernathy, his mouth hanging open, tears streaming down his face, and then she saw Julian Croft Jr. The applause was a verdict, and he was the one found guilty. The blood had drained from his face, leaving it a pale, mottled mask of pure, undiluted fury. His meticulously constructed world of power and privilege had been shattered by the one thing he could neither buy nor bully: genuine talent. He had been exposed in front of his peers, his fiancée, his entire world as a petty, foolish bully, and his tormentor was a servant. As the applause began to subside, Julian took a step toward the stage. A new, dangerous silence fell. His eyes, which had been merely arrogant before, were now filled with a venomous hatred. He walked to the table, his movements stiff and jerky. He snatched the pile of cash from the tablecloth. He strode to the foot of the stage, and with a vicious, contemptuous flick of his wrist, he threw the $25,000 at Ilara's feet. The $100 bills fluttered and scattered across the stage around the piano bench like a vulgar, insulting snowfall. "There," he spat, his voice a low, shaking snarl. "You wanted to perform? There's your payment. Now get off that stage and bring me a scotch." The crowd gasped. The open, brutal hostility of the act was shocking, even to this jaded audience. He was trying to claw back his power, to reduce her breathtaking artistry to a simple cash transaction, to force her back into the box he had created for her, to remind her and everyone else that she was still just the help. Ilara looked down at the money scattered around her. $25,000. It was a fortune. It was a solution, the logical, desperate part of her brain, the part that had spent years counting every penny, screamed at her to stoop, to gather the bills, to accept this final humiliation for the sake of survival. But then she looked up and met his gaze. She saw the bitter, unrepentant rage of a spoiled child who had been beaten at his own game. And in that moment, she understood something profound. Taking that money would not be a victory. It would be a surrender. It would be an admission that her art, her soul, the very essence of who she was, had a price tag, and that he had the power to set it. With a calmness that felt almost otherworldly, she stood up from the piano bench. She looked down at Julian Croft Jr., not with anger, but with a cool, clear pity. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "My father," she began, her tone even and measured, "lost everything he ever built because of a man like you. A man who believes that money gives him the right to destroy whatever and whoever he wants." She took a small step forward, away from the scattered bills. "He taught me that some things in this world are not for sale," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "My dignity is one of them. My music is another." She held his eyes for one beat longer, letting the full weight of her refusal settle upon him. Then, without a single glance at the fortune lying on the stage, she turned her back on him. With her head held high, she walked across the stage, down the steps and onto the ballroom floor. She moved past the stunned tables, past the gaping faces of Tiffany and the sycophants. She walked directly to the service station, picked up her neatly folded apron, and then her clunky, sensible shoes. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She walked with the unhurried grace of a queen abandoning a corrupt court. As she reached the main doors of the ballroom, she passed Arthur Vance's table. He was still standing. He met her eyes and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of pity. It was a nod of profound, unadulterated respect. Ilara gave him a small, weary smile in return, and then she walked out of the ballroom, out of the Orion Grand, and into the cool night air of the city, leaving behind a humiliated billionaire, a stunned society, and $25,000 lying untouched on a stage. The silence Julian's vicious act had created was finally broken by Arthur Vance's voice. It was not loud, but it had the resonant authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Well, Croft," he said, looking at Julian's father, Julian Croft Sr., who was sitting at a nearby table, his face a thunderous mask. "It seems your boy has a talent for making expensive mistakes. That was the most compelling performance I've seen in this city in 30 years. He turned to his own assistant. "Find her," he commanded in a low voice. "I don't care how. I want her name. I want to know everything about her. Arrange a meeting. Now." Julian Croft Jr. stood frozen, a pariah in the center of the room, the scattered money a testament to his spectacular self-destruction. The humiliation was a physical burn in his chest. His fiancée was already edging away from him, her expression one of cold calculation. He had made a fatal error. He had assumed the waitress was a pawn. He had discovered too late that she was a queen, and in this game, she had just checkmated him. By sunrise, the story had transcended the gilded confines of the Orion Grand. A freelance journalist who had been covering the gala's red carpet had captured the entire drama on his phone. The video was shaky, the audio imperfect, but the narrative was explosive. He sold it to an online news outlet, and by 8 a.m., it had gone viral. The headline was electric, the $25,000 tip. Croft Air humiliated by waitress at charity gala. The video was the centerpiece. It showed Julian's arrogant dare, Ilara's quiet walk to the stage, and then the breathtaking performance. The camera zoomed in on Julian's face as his smugness curdled into shock, then fury. It captured the contemptuous act of throwing the money and, most powerfully, Ilara's clear, calm refusal. "My dignity is one of them. My music is another." The internet seized upon the phrase. By 9 p.m., "My dignity is not for sale" was the #1 trending topic worldwide. For Ilara, the morning was a surreal tempest. She had awakened on her lumpy sofa bed, the adrenaline of the night replaced by the cold, hard dread of reality. She had lost her job. She had made a mortal enemy of one of the city's most powerful families. She had walked away from a sum of money that could have solved her most pressing problems. The harsh light of a queen's mourning made her defiance feel like folly. Her father's prescription was sitting on the counter, a constant, silent accusation. Then her cheap smartphone, its screen a spiderweb of cracks, began to buzz. And it didn't stop. Texts from former coworkers, calls from unknown numbers, friend requests from hundreds of strangers. A friend sent her a link. She clicked it, and her world tilted. She watched the shaky video of herself, a stranger in a black uniform performing a miracle. She scrolled through the comments, a tidal wave of support. This is what class looks like, and it has nothing to do with money. Julian Croft Jr. is proof that you can't buy talent, soul, or a decent haircut. Someone find this woman and give her a recording contract immediately. She didn't just walk away from the money, she walked away with his soul. It was disorienting. For 4 years, she had been invisible. Now she was a symbol. Someone had already started a GoFundMe page titled "A Proper Tip for Ilara." Its goal was $25,000. Before she had finished her first cup of coffee, it had sailed past $100,000. Meanwhile, in a sterile, minimalist penthouse office overlooking Central Park, the atmosphere was funereal. Julian Croft Sr., a man whose ruthlessness was legendary, slammed a solid gold paperweight onto his marble desk. The headline from the Wall Street Journal's website glared up at him. Croft Development, stock tumbles 7% on Air's viral scandal. "What were you thinking?" he roared, his voice a low, controlled growl that was far more terrifying than a shout. His son stood before him, pale and drawn. "She provoked me, father," Julian Jr. mumbled. "It was a joke." "A joke?" His father rose, a predator uncoiling. "We have the board of the Children's Ward Foundation issuing a public condemnation and severing all ties. We have city council members, who I have in my pocket, calling for an investigation into our labor practices. You took a multi-billion-dollar brand, our name, and you lit it on fire for sport. Tiffany Vandersloot had already released a statement through her publicist, announcing the end of their engagement, citing Julian's appalling lack of character. His sycophants were no longer answering his calls. He was utterly, completely alone. "I will fix this," Julian Jr. pleaded, his voice thin. "You will fix nothing," his father snapped. "You are a liability. You will issue a public apology, drafted by our lawyers. Then you will take an extended vacation, out of the country, until I tell you otherwise." Humiliated for the second time in 12 hours, Julian Croft Jr. slunk from the office. No longer an heir apparent, but an exile. Back in Queens, Ilara's day took another sharp, unbelievable turn. At noon, there was a knock on her apartment door. Peeking through the peephole, she saw a man in an impeccably tailored but understated gray suit. He looked serious, calm, and expensive. Cautiously, she opened the door. "Ms. Ilara Vance?" he asked. His tone was polite, respectful. "It's just Ilara. Yes. My name is Thomas. I am the executive assistant to Mr. Arthur Vance." The name took a moment to register. Arthur Vance, the man who had started the applause, the head of Vance Industries. "Mr. Vance was in attendance last night," Thomas continued, his expression unreadable. "He was extraordinarily impressed. He has asked me to extend an invitation. He would like to meet with you this afternoon at your convenience." He handed Ilara a simple, heavy, cream-colored card with a phone number and an address in Midtown. A meeting with Arthur Vance. It was a possibility so far outside the realm of her life that her mind struggled to process it. The viral fame was fleeting, a bizarre fever dream. But this felt different. This felt solid. Yes, she stammered. "I can be there." As Thomas walked away, Ilara closed the door, her back sliding down against it until she was sitting on the floor. She clutched the card in her hand. The fear and panic of the morning began to recede, replaced by a fragile, terrifying tendril of hope. The world had seen her play, but Arthur Vance hadn't just seen a performance. He had seen her, and for the first time in 4 long years, Ilara allowed herself to wonder if her life as a ghost was finally over. The offices of Vance Industries were the antithesis of the Croft Empire's gaudy aesthetic. There was no gleaming marble or ostentatious gold. Instead, the headquarters of Vance Industries was not a place of noise and frantic energy, but of a deep, resonant silence. It was the silence of immense, unshakable power, a quiet confidence that permeated the very grain of the dark walnut paneling and the plush wool of the corridor carpets. The air smelled of old leather, lemon oil, and paper, the scent of history and consequence. Ilara, dressed in the single best outfit she owned, a pair of carefully pressed black trousers and a simple silk blouse she'd found on a consignment rack, felt her orthopedic work shoes sink into the pile of the rug, a sensation so foreign it was unnerving. She was an echo in a cathedral, a ghost again, but of a different sort. Here her invisibility felt not like a professional requirement, but a profound and existential state of being. She was guided into a corner office where the city sprawled below like a circuit board, a map of lives and struggles she knew intimately from the ground level. From this height, it was just a beautiful, silent pattern. Arthur Vance was not behind the imposing mahogany desk, a throne of corporate authority. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette against the afternoon sun, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as she entered, and his eyes, a clear and piercing blue, fixed on her. They were not unkind, but they were intensely analytical, the eyes of a man who missed nothing. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the room's silence rather than break it. "Thank you for coming." "Ilara, please," she managed, her own voice feeling thin and reedy in the vast space. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Vance." He gestured not to the formal chairs opposite his desk, but to a pair of worn leather armchairs arranged near a low table holding a single perfect bonsai tree. It was a subtle but clear signal. This was not to be a corporate interrogation. "I confess," he began, settling into the chair opposite her, "I find most of society's entertainments to be a tedious exercise in vanity. Last night was a profound exception. What I witnessed was not a performance born of a dare. That was the culmination of a life's work. Ilara's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. It was, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A different life. Juilliard, he stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation of data received. My people are thorough. A full scholarship, the Dubois Prize for Interpretation in your third year. Then 4 years ago, you vanished from their records. The official reason was family emergency? He leaned forward, the leather of his chair groaning softly. The movement was slight, but it shifted the gravity of the room entirely onto her. Last night, you refused a sum of money that could have changed your life. You did it with a statement that interested me far more than the music itself. You said, "My father lost everything he ever built because of a man like you." The air thickened. This was the heart of it. He wasn't just a wealthy patron impressed by a parlor trick. He was a historian, digging for the root cause. A chill traced its way down Ilara's spine. The story of her father was a raw, festering wound she had guarded for 4 years, a private shame she bore in silence. To speak of it felt like a betrayal, like exposing his vulnerability to the world. But looking into Arthur Vance's unwavering gaze, she felt a strange, compelling urge to unburden herself. His eyes held no pity, only a quiet, intense focus that demanded the truth. And so the words came. At first they were hesitant, fractured things, but they soon found their rhythm, forming a torrent of memory and pain. She spoke of her father, David Vance, a man whose hands, thick with calluses, could coax poetry from wood. She described his small custom cabinetry shop in Brooklyn, a place that smelled of sawdust and varnish, a legacy passed down from his own father. She spoke of his integrity, a fierce, old-world pride in craftsmanship that felt anachronistic in a city of glass and steel. He won a contract, she said, her voice catching on the memory, the taste of ashes still present after all these years. It was the biggest job of his life, the custom millwork and cabinetry for a new luxury condominium, the Bayside Tower in Long Island City. It was a Croft development project. She saw a flicker in Vance's eyes, a minute tightening of the muscles around his jaw. It was the only sign that the name registered as anything more than a corporate entity. He poured everything into it, she continued, the scene playing out behind her eyes like a recurring nightmare. He mortgaged our house to take out loans for materials and to hire more men. He worked 18-hour days. His work was beautiful, flawless. It was already installed on the first 20 floors when they terminated the contract. On what grounds? Vance's voice was sharp, clinical. An obscure clause. Page 47, subsection C, a missed deadline for a third-party material certification. A piece of paper. Their own project manager had told him it was a formality, that he could file it the following week. It was a lie. It was a pretense. A month later, we learned they had hired a cheaper, non-union firm from out of state to replicate his designs and finish the job. They used my father's finished floors as the showroom to secure the lower bid. She took a shaky breath, the sterile air of the office feeling suddenly suffocating. They bled him dry. They refused to pay for the work he had completed, citing the breach. The loans were called in. He lost the business. He lost our home. The stress. It broke something inside him. He was on site, trying to plead with the foreman when he collapsed. A massive cerebral hemorrhage. The silence that followed was heavy, profound. Ilara felt hollowed out, drained by the telling. Vance stared past her, out the window at the distant silhouette of the Bayside Tower, a gleaming monument to her family's destruction. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with something cold and ancient, like iron dredged from the bottom of a river. 15 years ago, he said slowly, his gaze returning to her, Julian Croft Sr. used a nearly identical contractual trapdoor to bankrupt a steel fabrication company owned by a man named Robert Sterling. Rob was my best friend since childhood. He was my son's godfather. The company was his life's work. The Croft maneuver, as it's known in certain circles, destroyed him. He shot himself in his empty workshop 6 months later. Ilara felt the air leave her lungs. The room seemed to tilt. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern, a signature. The casual cruelty of the son at the gala was a direct, undiluted inheritance, from the calculated sociopathic cruelty of the father in the boardroom. They were predators of different stripes, but from the same bloodline. What Julian Jr. did last night, Vance continued, rising from his chair and pacing slowly before the window, was an act of supreme, generational arrogance. He made the one mistake his father is too disciplined to ever make. He created a public spectacle. He put a human face on the abstract wreckage his family leaves in its wake. He gave their victims a hero. He stopped and turned, his shadow falling across her. And in doing so, he gave me the one thing I have been waiting 15 years for, a perfect, righteous weapon. He looked at her then, his eyes stripped of all artifice. He was no longer just a powerful CEO. He was a man nursing a decades-old wound, a man who understood her grief in a way no one else could. "I am not a philanthropist, Ilara," he said, his voice hard. "Generosity is a luxury I rarely afford myself. I am a pragmatist, and I am a patient man who believes that all debts must eventually be paid. I find on this unique occasion that my strategic interests in a sense of cosmic justice have aligned." He moved to his desk, retrieving a thick, leather-bound folder. "The Vance Foundation supports many causes. I have instructed my board to create a new one, the Ilara Vance Fellowship for Disenfranchised Artists. Its mission will be to find and fund promising young musicians who have had their careers derailed by extraordinary hardship. It comes with a substantial living stipend, access to the world's finest tutors, guaranteed performance venues, and a fully furnished residence in a building our foundation owns." He placed the folder on the table between them. "I am offering you the inaugural fellowship." Ilara stared at the folder as if it were a strange, alien artifact. It was a lifeline, a miracle, a dream she had long ago buried. She could feel tears welling, hot and sudden. "But it comes with a condition," Vance said, his tone sharpening again. "A fellowship of this nature needs a public face, an ambassador. Its story must be told. You would be its first and most prominent voice. It will require interviews, public appearances. You would have to tell your story, not just the feel-good tale of the waitress who could play Chopin. The whole story, the real story, about your father, his business, and exactly what the Croft family did to you and to others like you." He let the implications settle in the quiet room. He was not just offering her a future. He was offering her a sword, forged in his own quest for vengeance. "Julian Croft Sr. is a creature of the shadows," Vance said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, lethal and precise. "He operates through shell corporations, armies of lawyers, and impenetrable contracts. He thrives on the silence of his victims. We are going to drag him, his son, and his entire corrupt enterprise into the blinding, unforgiving light. Your talent will be the overture, Ilara, but your truth will be the reckoning." He paused, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "It will be a war. They will attack you. They will try to discredit you, to paint you as a bitter opportunist, a liar. But you will not be alone. My entire legal division, my public relations firm, the most ruthless in the city, will be your shield and your spear. They will not touch you." He was offering her a chance to reclaim not just her own stolen future, but her father's shattered legacy. He was offering justice, served cold and on a global stage. The fear that had been her constant companion for 4 years was still there, a knot of ice in her stomach. But for the first time, it was overshadowed by something else, something fierce and hot and liberating. Rage. Tears streamed down her face now, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of validation, of a fury finally unleashed. She rose to her feet, her posture no longer that of a supplicant, but of a soldier. She looked at this powerful, dangerous man who saw her not as a victim to be pitied, but as an ally to be armed. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and resonant, echoing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Yes. When do we begin?" A rare, thin smile touched Arthur Vance's lips. It was a cold and predatory thing. "We already have." The announcement of the Ilara Vance Fellowship was not a press release. It was a tactical strike. It landed with the force of a precision-guided missile, detonating across every major news network and media outlet. The narrative, crafted by Vance's PR team, was devastatingly effective. It began with the viral video of Alara's performance, the symbol of her talent and dignity, and then pivoted seamlessly into the full documented story of her father's ruin, complete with copies of the predatory Croft contract. Vance's team had already found two other small business owners destroyed by the Bayside Tower project, and their stories were included as corroborating evidence. Alara was no longer a one-off anecdote. She was the face of a systemic pattern of corporate predation. Alara's first televised interview was The Crucible. She sat opposite a renowned, notoriously tough journalist, the studio lights hot on her face. Vance's team had prepped her for weeks, but as the camera's red light blinked on, a wave of sheer terror washed over her. She was just Alara from Queens. But then she thought of her father, of the hollowed-out look in his eyes for the past 4 years, and the terror solidified into resolve. She did not speak with anger. She spoke with a quiet, unshakable gravity. She told her story not as a victim pleading for sympathy, but as a witness bearing testimony. When the journalist tried to corner her, to suggest she was an opportunist collaborating with a known rival of the Crofts, she met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Vance and I are united not by a shared enemy, but by a shared experience," she said, her voice steady. "The experience of having someone you love destroyed for profit. My music is my own, but this story belongs to every family that has been crushed by the casual avarice of men like Julian Croft." The fallout for the Crofts was catastrophic. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. Their stock plummeted. A formal investigation was launched by the Attorney General's office. A class action lawsuit spearheaded by Vance's legal team grew by the day as more victims, emboldened by Alara's stand, came forward. Julian Croft Sr., a master of backroom battles, found himself trapped in a public relations nightmare from which there was no escape. Julian Jr. became a pariah, a walking symbol of entitled disgrace, his name a toxic asset. The end came not in a dramatic courtroom verdict, but in a quiet, windowless conference room 9 months later. Facing a mountain of evidence and the prospect of a public trial that would lay bare decades of unethical practices, Julian Croft Sr. capitulated. The settlement was massive, a 9-figure sum that would be distributed among the dozens of plaintiffs in the class action suit. It was a crippling financial blow, but for Alara, the money was secondary. Her non-negotiable term, the one Vance's lawyers fought for with relentless tenacity, was a full-page public apology in the New York Times, addressed to David Vance, admitting to grossly unethical and predatory business practices. A week later, Alara stood in the bright, sunlit day room of a world-class neurological rehabilitation center. The stipend from the fellowship, combined with her portion of the settlement, had secured the best care money could buy. Her father sat in a motorized wheelchair by the window, not the slumped, defeated man of her memory, but a man with a light back in his eyes. In his lap lay a copy of the Times, folded open to the apology. He had read it a dozen times, his fingers tracing the printed words as if to assure himself they were real. He looked up at her, his speech still slow, but his thoughts clear. "He taught me to build things," David said, gesturing with a trembling hand toward the window. You taught them how to tear them down." A slow, proud smile spread across his face. Alara felt a lump form in her throat. She moved to the upright piano in the corner of the room, its keys yellowed with age. This had become their ritual. She didn't play for concert halls anymore. The fellowship she now ran was her life's work, finding other young artists on the brink and giving them the lifeline she had been given. It was a different kind of music, a composition of hope and second chances. She placed her fingers on the keys. She no longer felt the phantom ache of amputation. The 88 keys felt like an extension of herself once more, not a lost limb, but a familiar voice. She looked at her father, her audience of one, and began to play. It was not the furious, defiant storm of the winter wind. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. The melody was not a weapon, but a balm. It spoke not of rage, but of resolution. Each note was a memory, a step on her journey. The opening theme was the quiet dream she had nurtured in her small apartment. The rising, passionate phrases were the terror and triumph of that night at the gala. The delicate, intricate passages were the careful, strategic dismantling of an empire. The music filled the small room, a quiet testament to a war won and a peace finally found. She had fought and she had triumphed. She had exacted justice for her family. But as her fingers moved over the keys, playing for the only person whose applause had ever truly mattered, she understood the profound truth of her victory. True power wasn't found in the thunderous applause of a crowd or in the ruin of one's enemies. It was found in the quiet, resilient notes of a simple melody, in the ability to heal what was broken, and in the strength to build a new life from the wreckage, beginning with yourself. She had not just won, she was whole.